Welcome back to Creepshow. Here we dive deep into chilling stories from history, peeling back the layers of human darkness, one tale at a time. Today, we're flipping the script. When we think of serial killers, names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Jack the Ripper often come to mind. But terror isn't exclusive to men. Some of the most twisted, calculated killers in history have been women. From medieval castles to modern cities, these women committed acts so horrific, they've left their own dark marks on history. So, settle in, grab a blanket, dim the lights, because we're about to reveal the top 10 most terrifying female serial killers. Number 10. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess of Transylvania. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 to an aristocratic family in Hungary, a family powerful in name and terrifying in reputation. At just 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier, and moved into Seti Castle, a foreboding fortress deep in the woods. As rumors have it, Elizabeth's husband shared some of her darkest interests, and together they established a chamber hidden away for their twisted pleasures. But her true reign of terror began after her husband's death. Elizabeth recruited 2 accomplices, her former nurse, Ilona Jo, and a woman skilled in witchcraft, Dorothea Puente, and began luring young peasant girls to her castle. Once inside, they were met with horrors beyond imagining. It's said Elizabeth bit, and tortured her victims. Some legends even claim she bathed in their blood, hoping it would keep her youthful forever. Though the truth of the blood baths is debated, her cruelty left a lasting scar on history. It wasn't until noble daughters started disappearing that the King of Hungary, Matthias II, took action. Elizabeth's accomplices were executed, but she was too well connected to face a public trial. Instead, she was imprisoned within the stone walls of her castle alone until her death in 1614. And with that, Elizabeth Báthory became one of history's most infamous female killers, a name whispered in horror through the centuries. Stay with us, because the list only gets darker from here. Number 9. Leonarda Cianciulli, the soap maker of Correggio. Leonarda Cianciulli was born in Italy, her life shadowed by superstition and tragedy. Married in 1914, she endured 17 pregnancies, 3 ending in miscarriage. Of the 14 children she gave birth to, 10 died young, leaving her with just 4 surviving children. Her devotion to them, especially her eldest son Giuseppe, was fierce. When World War II approached, Giuseppe was old enough to join the Italian army. The thought of losing him drove Leonarda to desperate dark measures. Convinced that human sacrifice would protect him, she turned on those close to her, 3 trusting women from her own neighborhood. Her first 2 victims, Faustina Setti and Francesca Soavi, were lured to her home, murdered, and dismembered. She dissolved their bodies in caustic acid, collecting their blood, which she dried, ground into powder, and mixed into a tea cake batter. Those cakes, shared with friends, family, and visitors who had no idea what they were consuming. Her cruelty grew with her 3rd victim, Virginia Cacioppo. After her death, Leonarda, impressed with Virginia's body fat, rendered it down with cologne to make soap. This soap, like the cakes, was given to others without a second thought. It was Virginia's sister who first suspected foul play, and her questions led the police to Leonarda. She confessed without hesitation or remorse. For her crimes, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison, followed by 3 years in a mental asylum. Leonarda Cianciulli's story lives on as one of Italy's darkest tales. For those intrigued by her twisted logic, her confession, An Embittered Soul's Confessions, is available. And in Rome's Criminological Museum, you can view the very pot she used to boil her victims, a grim relic of her gruesome legacy. Number 8. Aileen Wuornos, the Highway Killer. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. After a troubled childhood, she left Michigan, heading south and eventually landing in Florida, where she made a living as a prostitute. But her story took a dark turn, as she went on to shoot and kill 7 men over the course of a year. Her first victim, Richard Mallory, was found in December 1989. By November 1990, 6 more bodies had been discovered. Each victim had been shot, some multiple times. In 1986, Wuornos met Terry Moore in Daytona Beach. The two became romantically involved, though Moore wasn't involved in the murders. How much Moore knew, however, remains a mystery and a point of debate. Police closed in on Wuornos after they discovered a receipt at a pawn shop. It listed items belonging to Richard Mallory, but more importantly, it held a fingerprint. That fingerprint led directly to Aileen Wuornos. By 1990, Moore had ended her relationship with Wuornos and moved back to Pennsylvania. When Florida police tracked her down, she agreed to help them capture Wuornos. In a tense phone call, Moore coaxed Wuornos into confessing to 6 murders. On January 27, 1992, Wuornos was convicted for the murder of Richard Mallory. In the months that followed, she pleaded guilty to 5 additional murders, later admitting to a 7th. Peter Seams, whose body was never found. She was sentenced to death for each murder and executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Aileen Wuornos' story has since been immortalized in books and movies, most notably Monster, where Charlize Theron's portrayal of her left audiences haunted by the dark descent of a woman labeled the Highway Killer. Number 7. Amelia Dyer, the baby farmer of Britain. Amelia Dyer was a nurse and midwife in Victorian Britain, a time when many young mothers found themselves in desperate situations. These women turned to baby farmers like Dyer, paying her to take in their babies with promises of a loving home. But behind this promise lay something sinister. Amelia Dyer would go on to become one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. At first, Dyer allowed the babies to die slowly from starvation and neglect. Her actions eventually caught up with her, and she was imprisoned for 6 months. But this punishment did little to deter her. After her release, she resumed her deadly work. Only this time, her methods grew even darker. Many of the babies were strangled and then discarded in rivers or fields. Over 20 years, Amelia Dyer is believed to have murdered more than 200 babies, with some estimates suggesting as many as 400 victims. To stay ahead of the law, she moved frequently and used numerous aliases. But her crimes finally caught up with her when a baby's body, pulled from the Thames River, was traced back to her through a label bearing one of her aliases. This discovery led to her arrest. In March 1896, Amelia Dyer was convicted and sentenced to death. On June 10, 1896, she was hanged, her execution marking the end of a horrifying chapter in British history. Yet her story remains a chilling reminder of how trust and desperation were met with unspeakable betrayal at the hands of the baby farmer. Number 6. Juana Barraza, the Silent Lady. Juana Barraza was known in Mexico City as La Dama del Silencio, or the Silent Lady, a name she used as a professional wrestler. But behind this persona lay a woman shaped by a tragic past. Her mother, an alcoholic, had once traded Juana to men in exchange for booze. The wounds from this would fester into something dark. Her victims were all elderly women, vulnerable and often alone. Disguised as a social worker, Juana would dress in professional clothing, carrying a clipboard and stethoscope. She targeted women who might be eligible for social benefits, gaining their trust before her true intentions emerged. Some were strangled, others bludgeoned. And after each murder, Juana stole whatever she could find from their homes. Witnesses who spotted her near the crime scenes described a person with a manly build. This led police to believe the killer was a man, disguised as a woman. It wasn't until Juana was seen fleeing the home of her final victim, Ana Maria de los Reyes, strangled with a stethoscope, that police captured her at last. When questioned, Juana admitted to just one murder, citing a deep resentment toward her mother as her motivation. But the evidence told a different story. On March 31, 2008, she was found guilty of 16 counts of murder and aggravated theft, with 11 charges for separate murders. Her sentence? 759 years in prison. Juana Barraza's story is one of vengeance turned deadly, a brutal legacy forever shadowing the name La Dama del Silencio. Number 5. Jane Toppan, the Poisonous Nurse. Jane Toppan was born Honora Kelly in Massachusetts in 1857. Orphaned at a young age after her mother's death, and her father's descent into madness. She was taken in by the Toppan family, eventually adopting the name Jane Toppan. Despite early signs of emotional instability, Jane trained as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital. It's unclear if she ever completed her training, but soon after she worked as a private nurse. And in that role, her crimes would begin. In 1895, Jane committed her first known murders by poisoning her landlords. In 1899, she went on to poison her foster sister Elizabeth using a fatal dose of strychnine. But her crimes went unnoticed until 1901, when her killing spree reached a terrifying peak. That year, Jane targeted nearly the entire Davis family. It began with Mattie Davis, who died mysteriously while visiting Jane. After Mattie's death, Jane moved into the Davis home, and there her intentions became clear. Mattie's eldest daughter, Annie Gordon, sought Jane's care, and like the others, received a fatal injection. Within weeks, both Alden Davis, Mattie's widowed husband, and their youngest daughter, Mary Gibbs, had also fallen victim to Jane's poison. It was only after Mary's death that her husband and other family members became suspicious. An autopsy confirmed their worst fears. Mary had been poisoned. Before her arrest on October 26, 1901, Jane claimed one more life. When questioned, she confessed to 31 murders, yet was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sentenced to life in the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she lived out her days, eventually dying there in 1938. Jane Toppan, a nurse whose promise of care turned into a deadly betrayal. Number 4. Nanny Doss, the giggling granny. Nanny Doss was no stranger to tragedy, but many of those tragedies were of her own making. Born in 1905, she went on to kill 10 people, mostly members of her own family, using arsenic to poison those closest to her. Her killing spree began with her own children. Her first husband, Charles Braggs, found himself grieving the loss of 2 of their children, unaware that Nannie was behind their deaths. After these devastating losses, Braggs and Nannie divorced. He would be the only husband to survive a marriage to her. Her third victim was her grandson, who fell ill just 3 days after coming to stay with her. And in 1945, only a few months later, Nannie's second husband, Frank Harrelson, also died under sudden, suspicious circumstances. But the 1950s were when Nannie's deadly pattern truly escalated. Her third husband, Arlie Lanning, was poisoned in 1952, followed by her mother, 2 sisters, and fourth husband, Richard Morton, in 1953. One by one, they fell victim to her poisonous schemes. Nannie was finally stopped in 1954 when her 5th husband, Samuel Doss, became her last victim. Married only 4 months, he died after a sudden illness. An autopsy was ordered, and the results were shocking. He had been poisoned with enough arsenic to kill 10 men. When questioned, Nannie confessed to killing 10 people, but she was tried and convicted for only one murder, that of Samuel Doss. On May 17, 1955, she pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where she would remain until her death from leukemia in 1965. Nanny Doss, the sweet old woman with a sinister smile and a deadly recipe for love. Number 3. Miyuki Ishikawa, the midwife of death. Miyuki Ishikawa holds the dark title of being one of Japan's most prolific serial killers. A respected midwife and director of the Kotobuki Maternity Hospital, Miyuki took advantage of her position to commit unspeakable crimes against those she was supposed to care for, infants from poor families who had nowhere else to turn. At the time, social support for struggling families was nearly non-existent. Miyuki saw this as an opportunity and began neglecting these infants, leaving them to die from starvation and lack of care. Her husband, Takeshi Ishikawa, assisted her, and a local doctor, Shiro Nakayama, provided further support by falsifying death certificates to cover up the causes of death. The scheme went undiscovered for a time, until 2 officers from the Waseda Police Department stumbled upon the bodies of 5 infants connected to Miyuki and the hospital. Autopsies confirmed the chilling truth. None of these babies had died naturally. An investigation uncovered even more horrors. 40 additional infant bodies were found at a mortician's home, and 30 more at a temple nearby. In total, Miyuki Ishikawa's actions are believed to have caused the deaths of over 85 infants. In court, Miyuki, her husband, and Dr. Nakayama argued that they were providing a service and attempted to place blame on the infants' parents. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Miyuki received a shockingly light sentence of 8 years, while her husband and Dr. Nakayama each received 4 years. On appeal, these sentences were halved, causing national outrage. The public's reaction to Miyuki Ishikawa's case sparked change. Out of this horror, Japan saw a pivotal shift, leading to the limited legalization of abortion on June 24, 1949, a grim legacy that reshaped the nation's approach to family welfare and medical ethics. Number 2. Dorothea Puente, the deceptive landlady. Dorothea Puente didn't start as a notorious criminal. Her journey into the dark side began with minor offenses. Small-time forgeries, barely making a mark on anyone's radar. She was first arrested for writing bad checks and served 6 months in jail. In 1960, Puente was arrested again, this time during a police raid on a Sacramento brothel, and was sentenced to another 90 days. Shortly after her release, another arrest, this time for vagrancy, landed her back in jail for 3 more months. Once out, she managed to stay out of trouble for a while, working as a nurse's aide. Her charm and calm demeanor seemed perfectly suited to the role of caretaker. She began running boarding houses for the elderly and disabled, people who trusted her, people who needed her. Dorothea soon bought a large Victorian house in Sacramento, converting it into a boarding house. But this time her intentions had a darker twist. Puente began collecting the Social Security checks of her residents, some of the most vulnerable members of society. At first, she would simply drug the residents, steal their checks, and forge their signatures. This scheme earned her 3 years in prison, but the darkness in her only grew. Shortly after her release, things took an ominous turn. Boarders at her home started vanishing. There were whispers in the neighborhood, concerned glances and questions that went unanswered. Eventually, police were called to investigate. They dug up her backyard and uncovered a disturbing truth. Buried beneath the soil were the remains of 7 people, 7 former boarders who had once relied on her for care and protection. But that wasn't all. Many more former boarders were reported missing, their fates unknown. Dorothea was eventually charged with 9 murders, though only convicted on 3 counts. She received 2 life sentences, never to walk free again. Dorothea Puente's story is a chilling reminder of how trust can be betrayed and how some of the darkest secrets may lie just beneath the surface. Number 1. Lavinia Fisher, the enigmatic legend. Lavinia Fisher holds a unique place in history as the only supposed serial killer on this list who was never convicted of murder. Born in the early 1800s, she and her husband, John Fisher, were part of a group of highwaymen. While they were convicted of highway robbery, a capital offense at the time, Lavinia's status as a serial killer is heavily debated. The legends surrounding her life have become a blend of fact and fiction, leaving us to wonder what really happened. Here's what we know. John and Lavinia Fisher owned a hotel outside Charleston, South Carolina, called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House. According to one legend, men who last stayed at the hotel started disappearing. Alarmed, a vigilante group confronted the Fishers and believed they'd put a stop to the dark activities. They left David Ross behind to watch over the area. But that night, Ross was attacked by Lavinia herself and a group of men. Ross managed to escape and went straight to the police. The following night, a traveler named John Peoples stopped at the 6 Mile Wayfarer House looking for a place to stay. Lavinia offered him a cup of tea, but he secretly dumped it when she wasn't looking. He didn't like tea. Later that night, Peoples narrowly escaped an attempt on his life and went to the police, sparking their interest in the Fishers. A search of the hotel revealed belongings of the missing men and human remains in the basement. Another version of Lavinia's story, supported by more historical records, doesn't involve murder at all. In this telling, the Fishers' hotel was a hideout for highwaymen who used it as a base to carry out robberies. The police investigated, prompted by several robberies, and David Ross was stationed to watch over the hotel. That night, Ross was attacked by the gang, and Peoples, too, was later assaulted by the highwaymen. Whether or not Lavinia committed murder, she and John Fisher were sentenced to death. Since South Carolina law at the time stated a married woman couldn't be executed, John Fisher was hanged one day before Lavinia, leaving her a widow at the time of her execution. According to legend, she wore her wedding gown as she faced the gallows. Lavinia Fisher is often called the first American female serial killer, but she may not have killed anyone at all. Which version of her story is true? We'll leave that mystery for you to decide. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through the lives of history's most infamous female killers. If today's story sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepshow for more tales of the macabre. Let us know in the comments which case shocked you the most, or if there's another dark tale you'd like us to cover. Until next time, stay safe and keep an eye on those around you, because you never know what secrets people might be hiding. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of Creepshow.